let's wrap up the topic of Actinopterygii, thinking about niche diversification and the adaptive radiation. We look at the diversity of fishes. It's like if you look at the diversity of rodents or the diversity of flowering plants, you see it seems to be adaptive radiation. That is where you have a sort of almost an explosion of evolutionary lines that all go off in different directions, that is in different niches. You know, different feeding adaptations, reproductive adaptations, locomotion adaptations. That is, each one does something in a particular way different from another one. And you can see that from especially the shape of the mouth, shape of the entire body, where it lives in the water column, fresh water, salt water, how it reproduces, and so on. So the question is why is there so much diversity? A better question, I guess, is just how does this diversity evolve? Well, it starts, of course, with mutations. But for evolution by natural selection to happen, these have to have a mutation, and an offspring has to confer to that individual some advantage or disadvantage for evolution to occur, or some advantage relative to the wild type. And then eventually you get the evolution of different strategies or different structures that are alternatives to another one. Which one eventually wins out in terms of being represented in future generations is the one that has a net advantage. Much of this is due to sexual selection. So where it reflects adaptations for increasing individual reproductive success. Individuals that have this characteristic are better at have an advantage in mating. So in other words, the structure, whatever it is, gives them an advantage in mating, advantage in producing offspring. Much of it also reflects strategies that evolved, gave individuals an advantage in feeding. Believe it or not, incredibly, this includes fish that not just like mud skippers, which live out of the main water column, but also fish that can come out of the water and go back in. Where there's flying fish that actually literally fly above the water to get away from predators, or fish that find themselves by accident on shore, or they flip out in a way that's actually not necessarily intentional, but is very common. So there's been some research with the mummichog and with striped killifish. What's found is they can actually come out of the water, flip around on shore, and they're not helpless. I think those silver sides we saw that were laying on the shore when we brought them in, they were helpless. I mean, they just could not get themselves back in. But that is not the case for mummichogs and killifish and many other fish. So there's been some research done on this. This is pretty clever to try to figure out, okay, so they're able to find their way back into the water. Well, how do they do that? It's not like they can look around and say, I need to go that way. They don't do that. They just seem to flip in the right direction. So this is research that did this, that looked at this, and this is pretty clever. So the fish got dropped as if it were thrown out. If it swam, flipped itself out on the shore, and then they noticed where it went after that. So it's not the best video, but and so it has an option to go one way or the other. And they looked at where it actually went. And so they tended to flip themselves back toward the side that the water was on. So they can detect the water over there. Here's another example here. What they had here was foil on one side. And so it turns out they tried this with water and they tried it with foil. And what it looks like it is that it's the reflection off the water, maybe even UV light. That's what they're actually detecting. So that's pretty incredible, isn't it? And if you'll see this, and I've seen quite a bit, quite often, especially after storms like this big, these northeast gales we've been getting, with really, heavy seas and a big surf, is that fish will get themselves beached. And bluefish especially do this, and I don't think they can get back on land. So it's always a danger when you're pursuing something that's that might end up, you might end up over pursuing it and being splashed up on shore above the high tide line. Even if it is not above the tide line, you might be stranded. These are just some examples. Here's one example here. It's a bluefish. We caught quite a few bluefish this year. I'm just showing you the pictures that I have right now. Bluefish is a big sport fish, the perciforms. We caught quite a few of these here. Some of them actually bit us here. They are not adapted to getting off the shore, as far as I can tell. Here's just some other examples. What we're seeing here represents each one of these species does their thing in their own in a unique way. The way they feed, where they feed, how long it takes them to live, where they lay their eggs, where they deposit their eggs, how much if any parental care happens. This is an example here. We caught a couple of these that identified as a permit. I'm about 90% sure that's what it was. Certainly in that order. But this was one of the examples here, not from last year. Sea robins, we caught one. I didn't catch one this year, I don't think. But this is something you can actually see in the spring down at Napatree Point on the estuary side of Watch Hill over there. And you can watch these swimming around. Well, this is, these are it just represents adaptations for where they feed and how they get away from predators and how they move through the landscape. And they actually have modified pectoral fins, which are modified for flying, basically flying, almost like flying fish. And they will fly out of the water. However, what will happen is they can be grabbed or they'll fly out of the water and hit something and get stuck. We didn't catch any of the flatfish this year, but this is what does this represent? This represents, a feeding niche, but also anti-predator behavior. So where you are when you do your feeding, is much of that is an adaptation to avoiding predators. And the flatfish are pretty amazing at this. The way they can just basically predation risk is gone for them, except of course the humans go after these. And eventually they have to come up and feed, and when they do, they might accidentally grab a lure that a human puts out there. There's a puffer. We didn't catch a puffer last year, but this year, horse-spine stickleback, we didn't get that this year. This year, I don't know really what was wrong, but I can definitely tell you that the benthic layer of Nineveh Pond was bare compared to previous years. And I think what happened, if I had to guess, was that there was a lot more salt water in there, higher salinity this year because of the droughts. It's not as much freshwater input into that estuary, more salt water. So it could be that balance, that the salinity was at too high of a level to support the kind of life we usually saw there. Not as many crabs, didn't have decorator crabs. It's just a lot was missing there this time. I think it has to do with water temperature and the drought, somehow related to that. There's some years we get about every part of the year we'll get a needlefish. So some examples of feeding niches. This is one of the best examples of this is the Lake Malawi cichlids. So the rift lakes of Africa these are famous for, we call examples of the spacing on the word for it, of adaptive radiation. What you have here is, so these are these rift lakes. These are actually places where they're still, I believe, still opening. I think it goes all the way up to Red Sea. What you have here is an isolated natural lake. So that the fish, it wasn't always isolated. Eventually, it became isolated. Maybe it's splitting anyway. It's the fish here have had the opportunity to diversify into many different niches: deep water, shallow water. How close to shore they are, what they feed on, to what extent are they herbivorous versus carnivorous, and so on. And so the result is, and it was the cichlid group. So you have some early cichlid got in there somehow, and then diversified into many, many different cichlids. And these are the source of the Lake Malawi cichlids, which are really famous. I don't know if I have an example there. Tremendous diversity, very well-known aquarium fish. There's also a question about whether adaptive radiation actually happens, actually exists as we think it does. There's no doubt that the diversification happened, the evolution happened, of course, but whether it is a kind of almost an event-like thing where there are points in geologic time where you have bursts of much more evolution and faster evolution than in other times. It may actually just appear to be that. It may be that there is not, you don't actually get these bursts of rapid evolution at all. It's very hard to actually demonstrate that. It might not actually be true. The diversification might always be rapid. I don't really want to get into that. I just know that the adaptive radiation, inferring that is actually kind of difficult. These are just some of the example of the diversification here. So here's a species here that eats fish scales and fins, so it's parasitic. Crazy. Here's a fish that goes after eggs, fish eggs. Here's one that eats mollusks. Here's another one that eats small fish, like many of the predators around here, like pike. Another one that focuses on insect larvae, so the benthic feeder out there, and where they are in the water column. This is just an example here of the type of diversification. Where with the oceans, you have an extremely three-dimensional environment, especially down in the depths. How much in the light? There is a lot more deep ocean than there is shallow ocean. There's a lot more ocean than there is land, as well known. But this deep ocean part here is really interesting because, of course, much less diversity down there, but part of that's a function of the fact that we just haven't explored it really well. Here's an example of the kind of work that has been done where you kind of don't even know what's really there. So here's an example that this is an investigative team extremely far down. I don't know how many miles down. And they didn't know what this thing was. So this is a submersible. This is being viewed from another location. They didn't know what this thing was. It's obviously a fish. There's the fin. But what kind of fish is this? It just makes, they're speculating. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't have the shape of anything that's familiar to us. And then it transforms itself into a gulper eel. Why it was doing that, I don't know, but there it is. What's it doing down there? Well, there is a lot of nutrients down there. There's no photosynthesis at all. It's not like corals really grow down there. It's completely dark, obviously high, high pressure, also known as the pelican eel, and very dark. And so these are fish who are going to be predators on other fish that are down there and other organisms, but also those that are detritivores. We consider these fish to be strange, ethereal, maybe even kind of scary. Many of them are bioluminescent. They've got to find each other in the environment to mate. In the case of the anglerfish, many anglerfish, the male is actually parasitic. He's just this little tiny thing that attaches the female to her flesh, and then he atrophies and becomes nothing more than basically gonads attached to her, with just enough of a nervous system to fertilize the eggs when they spawn. This is one example of a fish that lives in the deep pelagic environments. More of them here. We have a bioluminescent lure. But it is a niche, and you think about the niche down here is one where there's not a lot of competition. Compare that to a coral reef. You have all the different species that feed on a coral reef, where you're competing against those for space, and they're individual or territorial. Not to mention the fact it's all lit up and by sunlight, and there's plenty of predators around. Um, so this zone here is called uh, the benthopelagic zone. So benthos means the bottom sediments. And so pelagic means basically deep and far out. So this out here, this would be far, far off the Narragansett coast. It drops off pretty quickly out there. So you don't have to go too far off where you're down over a mile deep out there. And then, of course, there's the famous trenches like off the Philippine Sea, 7 miles down. But anyway, what we're seeing here is niche diversification. Forms that you have species that are adapted to the conditions at those levels and aren't found anywhere else. So it's very hard to study them. Another thing is water temperature. So cold, dark, unfathomable pressures of water pressure. To be adapted to that had to happen over millions of years. And so you can think of it as, fish of some other species long ago finding their way into deeper and deeper environments, and that down the generations becoming more adapted to those environments and structures that evolved. Hard to imagine. But that bathopelagic fishes, just some examples of them. We got the gulper pelican eel there, and lots of others. Many of them look like this. Right there, this shows the female. For a long ago, they didn't hardly even know these existed because the tissues don't stay together when you bring a living, they're not alive when you bring them up, if you can find them at all, but they do wash up sometimes on shore. And actually, for the longest time, they couldn't find males and realized that the males were actually these little parasitic pieces of flesh attached to the female. Anglerfish. Believe it or not, fish actually will separate, will have niches night and dark, just like we see with mammals. Flying squirrels come out at night and go to sleep all day. Gray squirrels are just the reverse. They go to sleep at night and then they're out all day. So the gray squirrel wakes up in the morning, goes out to look for acorns and say, what happened to all the acorns? And the flying squirrel comes out at night into the darkness and says, where's all the acorns? Well, the gray squirrel stole them all day. So they eat the same things right now. They're scurrying around. What they really do is they go up into the trees, and they cut acorns, let them drop on the ground, and they race down the tree before another squirrel can get to it, and they grab it. And so if you hear acorns hitting the ground at night, those are flying squirrels harvesting them. If during the day, it's gray squirrels harvesting them. So with fish, they also separate, some of them anyway, specialize in day versus night. And so you can see this in the coral reefs. If you ever get the chance to be fortunate enough to snorkel in the coral reefs, you might be able to see this. I don't know how often you're able to go out at night in the coral reef, but if you were usually it's during the day, say you're in Cozumel, if you get lucky enough to go down an expedition during the night, you're going to see completely different species there at night than during the day, including a lot of sharks. There are also sharks during the day as well. But there are species that specialize on the night. They basically, you can think of them as having the night shift. What happened to the species that were there during the day? Well, they're not there. They're elsewhere. They're probably sleeping. It takes a different suite of adaptations to swim around at night. So these fish here, as long as they stay still, they are not seen by the sharks because this is all lit up here now, and normally everything would be dark, of course. And the nurse sharks are after it. A white tip reef sharks. One of them got one, fighting over it. During the day, of course, is the famous, you go out and do snorkeling or diving during the day, and that's what you see. Of course, it's just an incredible diversity, and you can hire a guide and go down there. And I've done this a couple of times in Belize, where you go out with a guide. You get an expert guide who will have a little wand, and you dive down with that guide, and the guide will point, say 2 different corals or whatever it is, go back up, catch your breath, and the guide will say what that was. And you have another person taking pictures, and you can buy pay to get those pictures later on. So it's a really fun thing to do if you get the chance. A tremendous amount of life. But the point is that you're going to see a different suite of diversity there during the day than you do at night. Night shift, day shift. And that wraps up the topic of fish evolution and diversity for the Actinopterygii. And on our next major module, we're going to look at the other line of bony fishes, the Sarcopterygians, and that is really the story of the evolution of the tetrapods.